My fighters are simply crushing them. They calmly drive by in armored personnel carriers, fly into the forest on motorcycles. They felt that the enemy is nothing, and that this is very important psychologically. They are now more confident in themselves and have no doubt that they will crush the enemy. This is a statement from call sign Balu, the commander of the Storm Squad in the Russian 810th Guards Marine Brigade, talking about his forces taking on the Ukrainian military in Kursk. And today we're going to take a look at some of the Russian tactics being employed during this Kursk offensive and what that tells us about this fight. Now, moving over to a map as a little background here. After 2 weeks, Ukraine has taken more than 1,200 square kilometers of Russian territory and continues to advance in multiple directions. The map that I'm using here is Suryak map. It'll be linked in the description below, along with all of the sources for today's video. Kursk is here in the northeastern portion of Ukraine, and 2 weeks ago, Ukraine kicked off this offensive into Kursk and quickly took over a lot of Russian territory. In recent days, it hasn't stopped. We're seeing more commentary from pro-Russian sources talking about Ukraine continuing to advance, especially here in the western portion of this pocket. And even earlier today, August 20th, there were reports that Ukraine has started to push across the border into this portion of Kursk near Tetkino, where Russian forces just a few days ago announced that they had withdrawn back to the east of this river. Now, that's just one report, but worth mentioning that the fighting is still ongoing and Ukraine is advancing in multiple directions. I think because of these continued advances, sometimes it gives the impression that what's happening right now in Kursk is easy or without risk, and that's not the case. Not the case here in Kursk or really anywhere in a war zone. Now, one of the sources I've regularly used to better understand what's not just happening in Kursk, but really across the Russian side throughout this war is Alexander Kotz. He's a Russian male blogger, and he just published a long interview where he spoke with a handful of soldiers from the Russian 810th Guards Marine Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet. And those are some of the soldiers that are trying to push back Ukrainian forces in Kursk. Now, the 810th has really been in the fight from the opening days of the war in 2022. They fought in Mariupol down in the south, conducted the siege of Azovstal, or were part of the siege of Azovstal. And it appears right now that the 810th was pulled off of the Pokrovsk axis to redeploy to Kursk. So at baseline, this is a combat-hardened unit. There's definitely been a fair amount of turnover in their ranks, right? Soldiers that were maybe fighting in Mariupol could have died, have been wounded, or have been sent back home for a variety of reasons. But it's safe to assume that there's a fair amount of veterans with combat experience in their ranks. These are also the 810th contract soldiers, or people who signed up to fight for the military as opposed to conscripts that were forced into some form of military service. Usually there's a discrepancy there in capabilities, desire to fight, and that's actually going to come out a little bit in this report. And what this interview, this series of interviews really shows to me is the second phase of the fighting in Kursk. The first phase was the surprise attack launched by Ukraine. Largely, they were taking on conscripts and border guards. The second phase, which we're kind of been in now for a couple days, is when the regular soldiers, the contract soldiers, rolled into Kursk. Now, turning to some of the interview here, Bull, one of the company commanders in the 810th, said, quote, "They," talking about the Ukrainians, "felt like they were the boss here. Now they've probably changed their minds. Our brigade stopped their main advance, and from now on, we'll only move forward." Now, I want to start here by saying that it's very hard to extrapolate across an entire front based off of the experiences of one individual unit. That's not unique to Kursk. That's not unique to the war in Ukraine. It's kind of warfare in general. There are still Russian forces that are attacking Ukrainian elements head-on and trying to push them out from Kursk elsewhere throughout this bubble. But it looks like, just from this interview, that the 810th is working in more of like a mobile, small unit type manner. They're waiting on the Ukrainian forces to advance. They lure them in a sense, and then ambush them from multiple directions before they have the ability to call for fire or to bring up reinforcements. Continuing with Bull, the company commander, he says, quote, "I think he," talking about the Ukrainian forces, "no longer understands where he is going. We watch from the copters, the drones, as the columns of equipment moves back and forth in circles. It feels like they don't realize where they are and where they are supposed to end up." Now, this actually lines up with some previous assessments about this fight that we've reported on in past videos, where there's not necessarily a clear objective on the ground. It's not that Ukrainian forces are trying to reach a certain building or an intersection or town. But instead, and this is coming from Russian sources in the early days of the fight, it's more of a probing maneuver-style warfare where they push out looking for weak points in the Russian lines and make noise, right? Because this is a variety of Russian military units that are trying to hold the lines here in Kursk. You have FSB, you have conscript units, you now have regular units, you have border guards and others, National Guard and others. So it's a very mixed up organization at baseline. And what the Ukrainians have been able to do from the early days of the Kursk operation is find kind of the seams in those units' lines. They push in, they make a lot of noise, which could entail driving around in circles, causing a bit of a stir, and they wait for a response. Now, if no response comes and no Russian force shows up, because again, there's some discrepancy in the chain of command here, they now have taken over a new Russian village. However, if a large Russian force arrives to try to push them out, the Ukrainian element then can kind of conduct a fighting withdrawal, move back a little bit, and try to probe in a different direction. Now, it's likely that this tactic that was successful, seemingly successful, for Ukraine to be able to take a fair amount of territory in the opening days of the war here, I mean, that's how they were able to advance at such a rapid pace in so many different directions. It's likely that tactic has had to change. If it hasn't already changed, it's going to change, just because that tactic of finding seams in the Russian lines and then exploiting them when they don't respond is taking advantage of chaos. And chaos is likely less now as more and more of these contract or regular soldiers roll in to this Kursk pocket. Now, there's two ambushes that the Kotz interview talks about here. The first one, they say, and they don't list the actual name of the settlement or where this took place in Kursk. There are some pictures that I'll show throughout this, but they don't give the exact location of where this battle took place. They say the settlement was in the rear. An enemy column moved up to 15 units, broke through our front line. First, we destroyed 4 vehicles, including 2 strikers. They advanced further into the village where we had reserves, the Storm Detachment and the Airborne Assault Brigade. We burned 4 more vehicles with an RPG-7. One of them rolled over, an American Hummer, and our BTR-82 was working on these 4. The score was 4-0. One vehicle went up a hill. Its engine was pierced by shrapnel. It stopped, and the remaining 4 went to the rear and were later captured. So it looks like in this specific case, the Ukraine did not have adequate intelligence before rolling into that specific village, and there really was clearly a significant Russian presence there. Right, you're talking about multiple elements of the 810th, including, as they say, the Storm Detachment and Airborne Assault Brigade waiting in the village where Ukrainian forces were headed. Now, this type of event, this ambush that Ukraine rolled into, kind of shows the downside of these rapid advances that we've seen in recent days by the Ukrainians. Sometimes, again, they roll into a new village, there's no Russian forces there, and other times, like we're seeing here, they roll directly into a set-piece ambush. This actually sounds very similar to some of the early reports in the opening days, weeks, and months of the war in Ukraine, when Russian elements without adequate recon would roll forward thinking there was going to be no Ukrainian resistance or that it had already been destroyed. And next thing you know, you see an entire column of Russian vehicles ambushed and destroyed at very close range. Now, this could mean, a couple takeaways here, is that along with the arrival of these contract Russian soldiers, the regular forces, they were able to bring forward a fair amount of electronic warfare capabilities, and they're doing a better job right now of jamming Ukrainian drones than they were just a few days ago. And that's entirely possible. You know, this kind of passes the common sense test. Electronic warfare has been a focal point all across the front throughout this war, and we have to expect that as Russia surges forces into this Kursk pocket, they're going to be bringing that capability forward. So in that case, it's entirely possible that Ukraine's recon forwarded their lines using drones to identify Russian elements before they push their own armored columns forward. That capability has likely been significantly reduced in recent days. Then turning over to the second ambush that they talk about here, they say, quote, a company of them, talking about the Ukrainians, drove in. First 7 units, then they decided to come from our left flank, another 4 units. We let them get closer so that they would feel more confident, and then my guys jumped out from around the corners and started to simply destroy them. Now, there's not as much detail here, but there is still some key takeaways from this short snippet from the 810th. First, we have to mention that Russia is able to achieve this element of surprise, likely because Ukrainian drones are not able to fly ahead of their columns in all directions. Electronic warfare, it's so complicated in so many different ways. It can kind of be a blanket where it shuts down just about everything overhead, but only for a certain area. The downside, of course, is you limit your own drone capabilities. It doesn't appear throughout this war that Russia has very, very targeted EW capabilities. It's much more blanket in nature, but that blanket can be very effective, shutting down entire areas of the front. It's possible what they're doing in Kursk is just blanketing whole areas, maybe to the north, maybe to the east, and shutting down Ukraine's ability to conduct reconnaissance in depth. Now, at baseline, it does look like Russia is not as interested in kind of set-piece battles here from fixed positions. There are defensive positions still throughout multiple areas of Kursk, but instead, they're trying to surprise the Ukrainians to where Ukraine can't bring in fires, be it drones, artillery, or mortars, or aircraft, to support their maneuver elements. Now, the longer any engagement goes on, anywhere along the front, the more opportunities that side has to bring in some sort of fires. Could be something as big as HIMARS, right? All the way down to mortars, artillery, and or drones. From this article, it seems like the way that the Russians are mitigating this, trying to avoid Ukraine bringing in these enablers, are quick, overwhelming ambushes that destroy entire columns at very close range. Now, elsewhere along the front, and in Kursk for the first week or so, a major concern, really on both sides, but we were hearing a lot from the Russians, was FPV drone strikes, or first-person view drones. These are the small drones where an RPG warhead or some type of explosive device is taped to it and it flies directly in to a target and detonates. Ukraine was using these in a variety of manners. We've got a video coming out later this week showing how they were using those to bring down Russian aircraft, right? So they kind of flooded the battle space with these FPV drones. That concern didn't come up in this interview at all. In fact, the Russians from the 8/10 were much more concerned about Ukrainian artillery, which again kind of hammers home the fact that Russian electronic warfare has likely increased significantly in recent days. Now, throughout this interview, they do note that Ukraine, in Kursk specifically, is hesitant to bring in artillery fire danger close to their friendly troops. So, artillery fire within, say, a couple hundred meters of the forward Ukrainian elements. We haven't really seen that concern elsewhere along the front, but it might just be a matter of Ukraine now moving into unfamiliar territory or having to pull their guns forward to a new firing point. In that aspect, it's one thing to call in a danger close mission when the coordinates are well known along a relatively stagnant portion of the front. It's an entirely different game when you're trying to update where your friendly elements are in the battlefield and fire from a new firing point with people forward that may not be able to adequately adjust that fire. And again, you might have significant deficiencies in the drones overhead able to adjust as necessary. Now, in closing, I do want to reiterate that this is one unit taking part in a much larger operation across Kursk. So while it's an example of how the fighting is playing out, I wouldn't use this interview from the 8/10 as to assume that this is how things are playing out across the entire Kursk region right now. And again, all of the sources used in this video will be linked in the description below if you want to check those out in their entirety. The interview here with the 8/10 was actually pretty long. I just pulled out a couple segments that I thought were worth running through and told us a little bit about how this fight is playing out. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.